Now, you haven't mentioned protein all that much
Mhm.
yet over the course of our conversation thus far. And I understand that prioritizing protein is important for many reasons. The satiety benefits, but also for preserving muscle while in a calorie deficit. Because we've all seen the headlines of a nutrition professor here and there who likes to make a point to their students by eating only Twinkies for a month or something like that to show that ultimately it does come down to energy balance, weight loss
Mhm.
specifically. Um, but obviously, when initiating a weight loss plan, I think most people would prefer to actually specifically lose fat mass as opposed to lean mass. So, what role would you say protein plays in this?
Protein plays a very large role. It helps in almost every direction. Protein is very satiating, at least up until your requirements. It seems that protein is more satiating than carbs and fat, or rather, your body keeps your appetite high until it has had enough protein. It's called protein leverage. Because protein is very important and it's very difficult to store for the body. The word protein actually comes from proteos, meaning of first importance. That's literally how important it is.
Wow.
So it's already in the name. And it also helps, not just, it doesn't just help with satiety. It also helps a little bit with energy expenditure because protein has a higher thermic effect of food than the other macronutrients. Again, at least up until requirements, because then it increases protein synthesis, which increases energy expenditure. Like muscle growth helps in two ways with fat loss. One is that muscle growth is an energy intensive process, meaning that if you are building a lot of muscle mass, then your metabolism goes up. It takes a lot of energy to build that. It's like building a house. You cannot just put the things there. The construction process itself is very demanding. So it helps in that sense. But what a lot of people don't realize is that muscle growth also helps and muscle preservation because when you create an energy deficit and the body has to make up that deficit by burning some of its own tissues, that's a zero sum game, meaning if you burn muscle, that's fat that you're not losing because the body got the energy from the muscle. And even better is if you're building muscle and you increase energy expenditure, and then the body has to essentially burn more fat to fuel that muscle growth process.
Hmm. Yeah, I've always, when initiating a fat loss phase, I try to dial in my protein target first, and then fill in the gaps in terms of my caloric needs with carbohydrates and fats,
Mhm.
typically. So, how much protein would you say one needs to set as a target? And does it differ whether in a fat loss phase or, say, a muscle building, a bulking phase?
So, based on the current research, it seems that about 1.2 gram per kilogram per day is sufficient to optimize satiety and most health benefits for someone that doesn't do strength training or in general doesn't do like rigorous exercise. Now, you should do rigorous exercise and you should do strength training, which means your requirements go up to at least 1.6 gram per kilogram per day. So
Hmm.
that's about zero point 0.7 gram per pound in freedom units. And if you really want to make sure that you're maximizing muscle growth, especially in something like energy deficits, more higher training volumes, then I recommend 1.8 gram per day, which is 0.82 gram per pound per day. That's total protein intake based on total body weight. But it assumes that you get that protein in, say, at least 3 meals, with at least 50% of your protein intake coming from high quality sources. Now, are protein requirements higher in energy deficit? Most of the research does not actually support that. It's a very popular theory. Funny enough, just last week, the first study was published which actually found some direct support for the idea that energy deficit does increase protein requirements, but it only looked at it on a single meal basis. There are multiple studies that find that 1.8 gram per kilogram per day is still sufficient in weightlifters, in energy deficit, in military personnel. There are a couple studies that show it's still enough. So maybe there is a small increase, but most of the evidence at this point does not actually support that.
Hmm. And how should one's protein intake be distributed throughout the day? Is there value to keeping it evenly distributed? Or I know there are some, I don't understand them, but there are people who prefer to consume one meal a day. Is there any downside to that? Yeah. What are best practices in terms of protein distribution?
If you want to really maximize muscle growth, I would probably recommend 4 meals a day minimum. I think you're going to also be able to maximize muscle growth with 3 meals per day. Below that, it gets difficult. And it's also important that every meal has at least a decent amount of protein. There are a couple studies, the evidence isn't crystal clear, but there are a couple studies which find, for example, that if you have 2 meals and then you have a small meal with only 5 or 10 grams of protein, you don't get the same muscle growth or the same protein synthesis or the same nitrogen balance, all measures of the same essentially, as you get if you have that protein intake in at least 3 meals distributed across the day. Because there is something called the muscle full effect, which basically means that on a per meal basis, you cannot just eat more and keep increasing your protein synthesis. Certain things increase the ceiling of protein synthesis, like doing a workout, fasting beforehand. But it currently seems unlikely that just 1 or 2 meals per day can maximize muscle protein synthesis throughout the entire day.
Is there any limit to how much protein the body can utilize in one meal? Sometimes you see this myth, or I don't know if it's a myth. I'm sure you can speak to it. This concept circulating on social media that the body can only use 25 grams of protein per meal.
Yeah, there is a limit to how much protein the body will acutely use for muscle protein synthesis. And multiple studies show that if you eat more than that, the body will usually oxidize the protein. However, recently there was a study which showed that that limit might be as high as 100 grams. If that is pretty much your entire protein intake for the day, you just had a workout and you were fasting before that. Right? So the limit is adaptable, and usually the body tries to regulate protein synthesis to accommodate your current schedule. But it is limited in that sense. Yeah, so there's a limit, but it's adaptable. And some people say, well, based on the research, maybe there is no limit at all. But I think we can pretty much rule that out de facto, because what if you had 1 meal per month? Like, I don't think there's anybody that believes you can maximize muscle growth for like a month with 1 meal. You just go to a steakhouse and pig out, and then you can fast the rest of the month. It doesn't work. So clearly there must be some limit, and based on the research, that seems to be about 3 meals per day if you want to maximize muscle growth. It doesn't mean you cannot have a successful diet with 2 meals a day. It just means that probably muscle growth will not be maximized, especially when you're bulking, like bodybuilding type program where you're really trying to do high volume training and squeeze out every little bit of muscle growth that you can. Then I would recommend 3, maybe even 4 meals per day minimum.
Well, I would assume that if you're eating a big mixed meal with fats and carbohydrates, and the meal has 50, 60, 70 grams of protein, say it's like your dinner, right? And that dinner is going to take hours to digest. Would you say is it a fair assumption that protein is not going unwasted?
Probably not, no. And there is some research suggesting that, like studies by Kim et al., they find that up to 80 grams seems to still be pretty much used for either protein synthesis or to reduce protein breakdown. So, a case can be made that if you time it really well, you can do it in 2 meals. If you do it in 2 meals, I think you have to time it really well with your workout, because there's also quite some research on the importance of like having meals around the workout and not training fasted. Ideally, you probably don't want to train fasted. I actually have a study on this that we just did, and we're going to publish that, which also supports this. Can't go into the full details yet, but it shows that we don't want to train fasted, basically, for maximum gains at least. So if you have only 2 meals per day, then at least one of those has to be somewhat close to the workout, and then the other one has to be somewhat close to after the workout. Typically, I recommend 5-6 hours between the pre and the post-workout meal. That's pretty much the maximum that you want to let pass, again, for like maximum body recomposition. So if you have 2 meals per day, that limits your options a lot. And 3 meals a day makes it just a lot easier, and means that the exact balance of is it enough protein in this meal and that meal becomes a lot less important. And then with 4 meals a day, it probably doesn't matter that much anymore.
If you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.